connecting. Oh, did you hear that? Recording in progress. Okay, so we are open. Now, looks like we have some participants coming in. Awesome. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll give you a few minutes to get yourself settled, and I am just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So we'll just go ahead and wait a minute and let people filter in here. It's like the big open the doors and let everyone come running in to get the best seats in the house. And let's go back to the beginning. Fix the PowerPoint. Doesn't want to go backwards. Okay, let's try this again. Here we go. Okay. All right, welcome everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started and give people an opportunity to continue to filter in. Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Dr. Erin Leaf. I am a senior lecturer at Monash University. I work in the Educational Psychology and Inclusive Education branch. I'm also the vice president of the ABIA, and I will be your host for tonight's webinar. So thank you all so much for joining us. Tonight is the second webinar in our series, all about navigating the NDIS. And tonight, we're really going to focus on getting kind of down to the nuts and bolts of how to become a participant in the NDIS and prepare for your first planning meeting. So this is really geared towards parents who are new to the scheme and who maybe aren't even participants yet and are looking for more information about just how to get started, how to become a participant, what to expect, planning for your first planning meeting, and then what to do when you get your first plan. So we'll go ahead and kick it off. In the spirit of reconciliation, the ABIA acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. So our panelists for tonight are all people who have a lot of lived experience navigating the NDIS. So we'll start with a few introductions. So when I introduce you, if you could just give a wave, that would be fantastic. So our first panelist is Shannon Eales. Shannon is the Managing Director for Autism Partnership Australia. In this role, she leads a team of passionate and talented people to achieve the best possible outcomes for children with autism and their families. And Shannon now also plays a key role in working with families to help them navigate the NDIS and secure funding for best practice early intensive intervention. We also have Bob Buckley. There's a wave. Bob is a parent advocate and the convener of Autism Asperger's Advocacy Australia, also known as A4. A4 was formed in response to growing demands from people with autism and their families who wanted more direct involvement in raising the profile of autism-related issues with decision makers, government, and through the media. A4's advocacy gives voice at national level for individuals and groups involved with autism across Australia. While helping individuals is not part of his systemic advocacy work, Bob has helped many families to navigate the NDIS. And finally, we have Vicki Stone. Vicki Stone, sorry. Vicki is a parent with lived experience. There she is. Vicki is a parent with lived experience navigating the NDIS. She's passionate about sharing her NDIS journey to help other families access the funding they need for evidence-based early intervention for their newly diagnosed children. So a few important things about how we're planning on running this webinar tonight. We're going to do this in a conversation style. So I'll be posing some questions to our panelists and giving them the opportunity to respond. We'll also have some notes on our slideshow to accompany some of their responses. As we're talking, feel free to type questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or at the top of your screen, depending on where you're looking. You will see a little icon that says Q&A. If you click into that icon, you can type in a question. It won't show up in the chat window, but I will see it. And at the end, we'll definitely leave time to be able to answer some of your questions. It's a little hard for us to provide sort of personalized advice around plans, but if we have questions that we cannot answer, we will invite you to send us an email to follow up. We are aware that there are actually a number of changes that are currently being discussed by government related to the NDIS, one of which is this idea of independent assessments. A lot of this is still in the discussion phase, so much is unknown about some of these proposed changes, but we will continue to monitor that situation carefully and bring you any up-to-date information when it becomes available. If for any reason you drop off the webinar, just log back in. There's no password. And our webinars will be recorded, so we'll make them available on our website later on. And the other thing I really want to point out is that the information in the webinar that we're presenting supplements our newly created parent packet. So the ADIA created a document that really talks parents through the process of navigating the NDIS from end to end. And that's all the way through understanding what the NDIS is and how to become a participant, to what to do if you're unhappy with your plan and how to ask for a review. So hopefully you have received that in some of the information that we've sent you. And that's definitely a good resource that you can go back and reference. Finally, if you do have any questions following on from this webinar, you're welcome to email info@adia.net.au with your questions, and we'll be able to follow up. So first question, we're going to kick it off with a question to Bob. Bob, can you tell us a little bit more about what the NDIS actually is? What is the purpose of the NDIS and how is it funded? Where does this money actually come from?
Sure, that's a great question. Sadly, the NDIS on its own website asks the question and doesn't answer it, so that's not really very helpful. I actually went there today to check that. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is fairly well named. It's a national scheme that provides support really for many people with disabilities, mostly aged under 65. So you have to be aged under 65 to join it. After that, you're expected to go into aged care. But it includes lots of people with, lots of autistic people get support from the NDIS, although not all of them. The point of the NDIS is that rather than taking a welfare approach to supporting people, it takes what they regard as an insurance approach. It builds people's capacity and skills rather than sort of just providing subsistence. So it really aims at doing things that lead people to have better lives in the long run, and overall keep the costs of the whole scheme down. The question about funding is pretty complicated. I don't think we really need to go into it. Basically, we can say that the NDIS is funded from taxes and from public money, from a bit from a Medicare levy and from state and territory government funding. The major political parties, however, fight about what that all means and where it's all coming from and all of that sort of stuff. So initially it started out not being particularly political, but it's become political since it's been running. But it's basically money from the taxpayers that pays for the NDIS.
Yeah, that's really helpful. You make a good point about kind of what is the NDIS, what is its purpose, and I think that it's interesting when you look at how supports for people with disability used to be funded in Australia. It was very much that block funding would go to service providers, and the service provider would decide how to spend it. So, and essence, the service provider had all the choice and control about how to support people with disability. And the NDIS is really designed to give the funding directly to the person so that the person can decide how they want to best be supported, and really embraces this whole idea of choice and control for individuals and families, which is a beautiful sentiment. It's actually a world first. However, it's really tricky when you translate that into practice when people have such diverse needs and want such diverse things. And so a lot of the debate right now centers on this whole idea of, well, what should the NDIS fund? What is likely to be effective and represent value for the money? And I think that's where these nitty-gritty decisions have to get made. And there's often some disagreement about what that looks like.
I think the other thing that's worth making is that the national scheme makes a big difference. Before that, each state had a whole bundle of stuff. It had some things that were sort of like a preliminary to the NDIS. So there were individual support packages in some states, but they weren't transferable between states. If you moved from one state to another, you had to renegotiate the whole lot. You went on a whole bunch of new waiting lists. It was really very, very, very difficult. And the other thing to point out is that the NDIS did bring more money into this space. So in fact, most people are probably better off under the NDIS than they were previously. The challenge is that we want it to be significantly better and to actually make people's lives. So although it's made big improvements, there's also a lot of more improvement that could still be made.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, it's interesting. It's really about giving you as families the ability to choose how you want to be supported and what's going to work best for you and your family, which I think is really, really revolutionary. So we're trying to help you see that executed in practice. I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. Shannon, can you tell us a little bit more about who is actually eligible for the NDIS? What do you need to, I guess, know whether or not you can access the scheme? And if families don't know, if they're having trouble figuring out if they're eligible, who can help them?
Yeah, sure. So there are two main streams, I guess, that we work mostly with. So that would be children under 7. So if you're parents and your kids are under 7, that would be the stream you enter under, and then people over 7. So if you're a participant or a potential participant, or you have a child who's over 7, you can do an access request. There is more information both in our booklet and on the NDIS website. It sort of takes you through an access checker to see whether you or your child is eligible. And what they need to have is significant disability that has a significant impact on their life. And there's sort of different lists of diagnosed disabilities, and if you're on a certain list, you automatically get entry, and then there are other lists where you need to provide more information. You won't come across those lists if you just go through the regular NDIS space, but most people that we work with who are over 7 are receiving NDIS support. Sometimes you have to provide more information if you or your child has a diagnosis of autism level 1, but most people that we see do get some support. So there are some people where they would say, this is not significant enough, so you should access community-based supports. So that's for over 7. So you would go onto the NDIS website and it takes you through a series of steps. For the under 7s, there is the early childhood gateway or the pathway. So you would go, the NDIS have tended to some other organisations to provide a service that is aimed at children who are young, so under 7s, as an entry potentially into the NDIS. So you don't have to have a diagnosis, or your child doesn't have to have a diagnosis to enter that pathway. It's, part of the reason it's there is for if anyone's raising concerns about a child's development, they can refer to the early childhood partner, and the early childhood partner will work with the family to see whether there are community-based services that will meet your needs, or whether you need to go on and get an NDIS plan. Mm-hmm. So that's good for kids where, no one's really quite sure yet. They're just watching some low intensity intervention. may help, but for most of the kids that we work with, they are very close to diagnosis, or it's clear what they need. And you don't really want to linger in that early childhood gateway for too long. So you can request to go on to planning. So if you find yourself in working with your early childhood partner, and they could provide services for you for up to 6 months, but actually probably what you really need is to get into some other services and try to expedite things and request that you go actually to planning or to call the NDIS hotline yourself and ask for an access request, which you can do over the phone or via a form online. So if your child has a diagnosis or professionals are making really clear recommendations about what should happen for your child, don't wait. Don't sort of have that low intensity intervention for 6 months. Contact the NDIS if your early childhood partner isn't already referring you for planning. So they're the two ways, which I think Erin's got some more information there, of how you can access the NDIS.
Yep. So basically, it's actually laid out pretty clearly on the NDIS's website. It basically gives you a couple of different options in terms of calling a phone number, submitting a form online, or getting you in touch with what's called your local area coordinator or local NDIA office for families with kids over the age of 7. And all of these different avenues will essentially allow you to put in what's called that access request form. And Shannon, do you know after the access request form is lodged, what happens?
So after you lodge it, I would be calling the NDIS to follow up on that. They should be back in touch with you in a reasonable amount of time. I actually think they're required to be back in touch with you in 14 days to acknowledge your eligibility or not. But the key to the NDIS is not waiting. I think if you wait, you can wait for very long amounts of time. So if you're keen to get into service, you make the access request. They will tell you they have 14 days to deem you eligible or not. And then there'll be a planning meeting after that.
And we talked a little bit about the pathways for children under the age of 7. This is a little bit different, like Shannon mentioned. For children under the age of 7, there's something called the Early Childhood Early Intervention, or ECEI pathway. And as Shannon mentioned, the purpose of that is to see if we can quickly get kids and families into some more mainstream or community-based or lower intensity intervention. That may include some parent training and parent support. It may include some services with an allied health professional. But rather than taking a let's wait and see approach, it's aiming to get kids into support early. So Shannon, have you worked with families who have wanted more intensive intervention, but who have actually been recommended to go down the early childhood, early intervention pathway? How have they dealt with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you could be with one of the early childhood partners and they might be saying, let's do some things for a couple of months and see how they go, or we can't get a planning meeting yet. And I would really encourage you to contact the NDIS directly if you're finding that you are getting caught in that system at all. It's really not designed to do that. There are, eyes wide open and all the information. Early childhood partners, there are KPIs for how many children come out of there and actually end up in a plan, and can leave all that to them. But I think if professionals are making clear recommendations of what services your child needs, and for a young child with autism, that's going to be more than fortnightly speech or OT, then you need to really get to planning as quickly as you can. So if you're not having luck with your early childhood partner referring you for planning and organising the planning date, then I would be on the phone to the NDIS.
And I think that brings up another good point, is that as part of this process for families that are new to the scheme, the more information you can be collecting from your GP, your developmental pediatrician, any service providers that you're currently working with around recommendations for more intensive early intervention, particularly for young children with autism. This is a critical period, right? We really want to give these kids good intervention so that we can set them up to transition into the least restrictive educational environment, i.e. mainstream school, as successfully as possible. So we don't want to families getting stuck, not getting what they need in this early window of time. So as Shannon mentioned, be kind of pushing this forward by calling the NDIS directly if you're getting stuck kind of at this stage. Vicki, did you find yourself going through this process at all? Or when you were new to the scheme, did it go straight into planning meeting?
We actually went straight into planning meeting because
Yeah.
my son already had a diagnosis.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah.
So having that formal diagnosis beforehand seemed to help kind of expedite the process for you.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Gotcha. All right. So next question is for Vicki. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what families can do to actually prepare for their first planning meeting. So now we're assuming that families have become they put in an access request, they've been deemed, eligible to access NDIS, they need to go to planning because they need an individualized funding package. What types of documents and reports will it be helpful for families to have, or do you have any other tips or strategies for preparing?
Yeah, so definitely be organized. Once you have a date for a planning meeting, a number of weeks before that is when you want to be contacting your providers, anybody who's working with your child. So whether that's therapists or a pediatrician or preschool even, or daycare, and asking for reports outlining your child's needs. And, if possible, particularly from pediatricians and therapists, recommendations about what they need moving forward. Also sit down and really have a good think about your child's needs and the impact of their disability on them and the whole family. Some things like speech delays are really obvious. And of course, every family wants their child to talk, but the NDIS is looking at all areas of support. So have a really good think about all of your child's needs and make sure, you're prepared to talk about them as well. Have a think about your child's goals, what you want to get out of intervention or intensive intervention. You and your child decide those goals, and the plan must help your child work towards them. So they are really important. Bob will talk a little bit more about them later. He's got some great ideas. Have a think about, you want to state really clearly what you're asking for and why you think it will help achieve your goals. And also you want to write a carer's impact statement as well. I guess just really having that think about your child's needs. I mean, many parents get really good at meeting their child's needs. So much so, sometimes you almost forget how much more you're doing than parents of typically developing children. So that's the kind of stuff you want to think about before the meeting. Think about whether or not you always do things in a certain way because that's what works. Think about, whether or not you're often interpreting for your child, not just their speech, but maybe you're interpreting their body language and their emotions and whether or not they're about to have a meltdown because other people can't tell. Think about how much you're trying to, you control the environment to make things work, because they're all things you want to address in therapy and in intensive intervention as well. So you want to make sure that you've kind of thought about that and you're clear to talk about that in the planning meeting as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think that sometimes I think as parents, especially parents of newly diagnosed children, you want to defer to other people to tell you what you should be working on with your child. But we really want to kind of embrace the process of person-centered planning here. And we want you to feel empowered to tell the NDIS planner what you want for your child. Your goals are your goals, not somebody else's goals. And so really having a think about what do you want for your child in the short term, the medium term, the long term, and what kind of supports are going to help you achieve those goals. Shannon, do you have anything to add to that?
I think when you're collecting reports from your professionals, it's very helpful if there's consistency in the recommendations of what they are saying your child needs. It's also really important to talk about what you have tried and what hasn't worked before, particularly if you're wanting to secure funding for early intensive intervention, because the NDIA will say to you, okay, well, you first need to go and try low intensity intervention and see if that works. And then you need to try low intensity ABA before we'll fund intensive ABA. They will try these things. So it's really helpful if your professionals can say, this child has been doing this for the last 6 months or 12 months or 3 months, however long, and you haven't seen any progress. So now the recommendation is for more intensive services. It's really important that that's really clearly articulated. And I think it's not, and I think sometimes families can feel uncomfortable too asking providers. So you might have been in speech and it can be hard to say to them that, you know, we've been having all low intensity anything and for 6 months and we haven't seen any progress. But it's really important that the reports that go in are consistent in that message if you're looking to fund intensive intervention.
Great, thank you. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the care impact statement, because we think this can be a really useful tool for you as a family member to articulate the supports that your child needs and how that's going to impact your day-to-day life as a family. Vicki, can you tell us a little bit more about what a care impact statement is and how it should be written, or what types of things should be considered?
So basically, this is just your opportunity to get across everything you want to get across. I think it's really easy. So when you go into a planning meeting, the planner or the LAC will have their own list of questions to get through. And it can be really easy in that process for you to forget to say something or to miss something out. So this is kind of an opportunity to provide them with a written statement as well. So I think it's really important to get this right. So in this, you know, you want to introduce your child, you know, talk about their likes and their dislikes, and, you know, allow the planner to get to know a little bit about your child. And then, you know, move into talking about how their delays or their disability or their diagnosis affects their life and affects the whole family's life. It is important to include that too. So the planner's questions will focus, I guess, on delays and to an extent behaviours, but often they don't really capture what that means on a day-to-day basis. You know, it might say that your child has limited play skills, and that is, you know, one sentence. But for you, that might mean that you need to occupy your child for their every waking moment. It might mean that if you leave them for a short period of time, they are, you know, switching the oven on and off, or playing, you know, flooding the bathroom, you know, whatever that means for you. I guess, you know, talk about whether or not they've been able to, you know, engage in mainstream activities, or whether or not you've had to pull them out because it hasn't worked. Talk about how they communicate. Yeah, so basically kind of cover all of that, but more from, you know, the family's perspective rather than from a provider clinical perspective.
Yeah, in our parent packet, we have a nice little template that families can use to help them draft a care impact statement that really encourages them to think about all the different sort of developmental domains or areas of life where your child might need support, or that impacts your life as a family, and sort of some leading questions like what you see here to help you think about what areas you could use the support and how that support might benefit your child and your family as a whole. Shannon or Bob, did you have anything to add about writing a CARES impact statement?
I wasn't planning on saying anything.
Okay, go for it.
But I guess the little things in life, like you go out and you can't sit around and socialize while your child is occupied in many cases, that sort of you get to say 2 sentences and then you're dragged away or diverted from anything that you're doing. So your life really changes in many cases quite substantially. And I think parents are sort of hesitant to say this. You know, your family visits get a lot shorter in many cases. Just having to attend to a child intensively is actually quite difficult. So the NDIS doesn't like funding respite for young children. So you have to sort of say that you need it, but you also have to say that you're willing for them to be doing some sort of intervention or group activity or something in that time. So there's tricky stuff in here about understanding what the NDIS likes you to say so they can provide services as well. And it's probably good to talk to the people who are going to be providing services because they have experience with this. Get them to help you with the words around this. So when you talk to them about what they need, you also need to keep in mind that you're then going to have to communicate it to the NDIS.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think a lot of the families that we've supported have all already been working with a service provider, so they have been able to use the service provider as a kind of a support network to help them put together their application and answer questions and navigate through the process. So definitely, you know, if you're working with a service provider already, they should be prepared to help you. For families that aren't currently working with a service provider, that's okay. You can work with your GP, you can work with, you know, daycare providers, or even get other family members to give information that might be helpful. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about writing goals. I hear a lot, I see a lot online of questions when families get access to the scheme and they find out they have to write goals to bring to their planning meeting. They kind of are confused about, well, how do I write this? Or what is a goal? Or what should I be thinking about? Bob, can you tell us a little bit more about writing goals and some tips and strategies?
So writing goals is a fairly big issue in the NDIS. It's sort of, the NDIS won't tell you this, but the first things are there's a little bit of language to get round. The NDIS always talks about supports. When they talk about the supports, they're actually talking about the services that you access. They're talking about disability interventions and everything else, but they tend to use the word support for a whole bunch of things that you might use other words for. So be wary about that. The NDIS Act, the law that brought this into place, says that you write your own goals. Okay, now this is a bit of a challenge for all the bureaucrats sitting there in the NDIS, but you technically they'll tell you that you can only have 2 goals, or they'll tell you that they have to be written in a certain way or whatever else. The law says you write your own goals, but you need to keep in mind that to be effective, your goals should be disability related, and they need to be what's reasonable and necessary. And we sort of talked about at the last section what that meant. But basically, you know, you can't ask for too much money, and things that are necessary you can ask for, but they may not deliver them the way that you thought they might. So it's necessary to do things, but not necessarily in the way you ask for them. When it comes to goals for somebody with an autism diagnosis, I always suggest that every person needs a long-term goal that is to enjoy my life as an autistic adult, including social, economic, and cultural participation in my community. And I would suggest that every single autistic person put that in, because that sort of relates to the diagnostic criteria for autism. And having it there always means that you've got a fallback to be able to sort of say, well, what are you doing to address that goal? Okay. So I would always have one of those in, a long-term goal around that long-term life. And these are basic human rights that you're talking about here. Medium-term goals, even for young children, would be that you're looking at accessing an effective education. So even for really young children, the goal is going to be to get them into a situation where they're going to access an effective education. So I would always make that a medium-term goal for anybody who isn't an adult. And you can put it in an adult's one if you think that it's appropriate. So yeah, And the other thing that's sort of necessary is that most autistic people need some sort of guidance around behaviour support. I would always have the need for behaviour support in an autistic program, even if you're not going to act on it initially, to have it there, because you're talking about a plan that's going to be at least a year long. And just having the option to go and access those kind of services when you need them is crucial. So a bit about behaviour, a bit about accessing education. And then you think about your short-term goals. And the short-term goals can be things that they ought to be things that you're going to achieve over a year for a year plan. If it's going to be longer, then make them a little bit longer. You can have shorter ones as well, right? So you can have a goal that's probably going to only last 6 months, and if you achieve it, that'll be fantastic. And you may want to revise that later on. But certainly I'd be aiming at goals that are sort of going to be in effect for about a year. For young children, I'd do things like relying on what the research says. So your clinician should be able to tell you that the goals for a young child is probably to have a comprehensive program of intensive, individualized, ASD-specific and evidence-based intervention for their ASD. That would be one goal. And then specific things about, expressive and receptive language, about playing with other kids, those sorts of things can go in there as well. I wouldn't go for too many, right? So I've sort of talked about 5 or 6 goals there before you get to specific ones. I wouldn't be worried about that. You sort of need these long, medium and short-term goals to be covered. I don't know if you guys can hear my son in the background. Yeah, those are the main things. But remember that they're your goals. And if you don't get, the other important thing is, if you don't get them right first go, you can actually go back and change them at any time, right? So a lot of people get really nervous and worried about getting their goals right. I would say to you, get goals in there. And then if you think about them later and go, well, maybe I could have written that better, that's okay. You can just go back and say, change my goals. And they cannot refuse. The law says you can change your goals at any time. And if you add goals, if you forgot something, that means that you can say, I need my plan reviewed to address those goals. So your goals are fundamental. They're under your control. They are the things that drive what your plan is going to be, or at least they should drive what your plan is going to be. So they're worth thinking about, and they're worth thinking about over time. So
yeah, I think it's really helpful to think about those big picture long-term goals, even for a young child, about accessing an effective education and living a good quality of life, economic, social, cultural participation as an adult. And then your service provider through the journey can help you with the strategies, right? How are you going to achieve the goals? But it's really up to you to think, what's your vision? Like, what do you want for your child in the long term? And just frame those as your goals. Shannon or Vicki, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Bob always does the best job of talking about goals.
Talking about goals, right?
Too kind, guys, too kind.
Okay, so now let's say you've thought about your goals. Now you're ready to go into your first planning meeting. Vicki, what actually happens at the planning meeting? Do you go into an office and sit in a room with a planner? Do they come to your house? What do they do? What do they ask you?
Well, to be honest with you, we've had multiple ways this has happened. We've had them come to our house. We have been into an office, and we have done it over the phone. I guess if you're not comfortable doing it over the phone, which some people aren't, it is harder to communicate over the phone sometimes. It is important to tell them that you're not comfortable with it, but with COVID at the moment, it can be a little bit tricky to have a face-to-face meeting. But yeah, basically you meet with either a planner or more likely, if you have a younger child, a local area coordinator They have a set list of questions to go through. They're going to talk about, what day-to-day life looks like, what support you have, any delays that your child has, and any behaviours that your child might have. And I guess it's important to, when you're answering their questions, to be really honest. If you are struggling to cope, tell them. They are looking to put supports in place. So definitely don't go into a planning meeting trying to put a good face on how things are going. Be honest about how things are going. If you are finding that, you are turning down all of, extended family activities, tell them that that's happening and that you want that to change. If you are losing some of the supports that you have, if you're, because you can't go out anymore and you can't do things, tell them. If you're struggling to cope with your child's diagnosis, again, tell them, because they are looking to put supports in place. When they are asking about, delays, they might be asking questions like, can your child do something? So it's really important when you answer those questions is that the whole question is, can your child do this consistently and independently? So you don't want to be saying, yes, they can do it because they did it once or twice, but they don't usually do it. You don't want to be saying, yes, if, sometimes I can, after an hour's battle, I can get them to do that. So it's, can your child do it consistently and independently before you're saying, yes, my child can do that, especially when you're talking about your self-care skills. Don't be afraid when you're in the planning meeting to ask questions, and don't be afraid to, ask them to pause and let you have a chance to think about your answers as well. And I really strongly recommend that you bring a support person with you. Don't go into the planning meetings alone. Bring somebody who knows you, who knows your family, who knows your situation, to provide that support for you as well.
Great, thank you. And then what happens, Shannon, after the planning meeting? How long until families should expect to get their plan?
Yeah, so usually your planner will tell you how long they think that will be at the end of the plan, meeting. Usually a couple of weeks. I would again be calling them. I'd probably give them a week, and then I would be calling to follow up and to get your, again, if you wait with the NDIS, you wait for sometimes a long time, sometimes not, but I would never be afraid to get in contact. Definitely it is a squeaky wheel.
We've seen this work many times.
It consistently works. Waiting and being nice and patient. Obviously you're always nice, but being patient and not wanting to bother them really doesn't really get you anywhere. So sometimes they'll come back and ask for more information, or they might want, different quotes or something like that might come up after the planning meeting. But again, I would be stressing to them the importance of having access to that funding and really being on their case to get that done as soon as possible.
Yeah.
How long would you, Bob?
24 hours.
I'm not that mean. No, look, I think you have to allow them a bit of time to get it done, but you may have to prod them if it's taking too long.
Yeah. Yeah, in our parent pack, we also describe the different ways that you can manage your funds. And so you do have some choices around whether you want to self-manage and you'll be responsible for paying your providers and then claiming your own reimbursement through the NDIS, or whether you want an intermediary who can help you manage your funding. If you do think you want an independent third party to help you manage funding, then, go into your planning meeting and be prepared to ask for money in your budget for that. Or you can be managed by the agency, in which case the agency will pay your provider directly. So we talk a little bit about what these different methods of using your funding or paying your bills mean, and how to kind of pick one that might be best for you. And then, if you're with a therapy provider that you're happy with, fantastic. Stay with your provider. Make sure you're taking data on your child's progress so you have compelling evidence when it comes time for a plan review, or to detect if things aren't working and you need to make a change. And know that you're not tied to one specific provider. Your funding goes with you. So if you do want to change providers, you can. It's completely in your hands, and wherever you choose to go, your funding goes with you. So just keep that in mind. And then last question, unless Bob, you wanted to add on to that?
I just wanted to say that's one of the big changes of the NDIS is that the funding, however you do it, pretty much stays with you, whereas before that didn't used to be the case. So that's a big win for the NDIS, that one.
Right. Bob, can you tell us a little bit more about who families can turn to for help or support along the way if they are trying to navigate this process, but they get stuck?
Sure. There's lots of people to turn to, and although I can list a whole bunch of them, they're not always going to be effective, okay? But the first thing I'll say is families need to learn to ask for help. I mean, this is a big lesson of having a child with autism, is that you shouldn't do it on your own. You need to build a community around you who is really going to support you and expect to do that, learn to do that. It's the first skill, one of the most important skills, and it's hard for so many families. I'm really aware of that. I mean, we found it hard. So just think of the people and who might support you. The first place you can go is the NDIS, right? Just try them first. Sometimes they are actually helpful, but often they're not. And they're actually not very good at giving information about the NDIS. There are huge Facebook groups that exist because the NDIS is so bad at giving information that people go to peer groups to get information. So try the NDIS. Don't always believe what they say. Get a second voice on that sort of thing. There are autism groups and there are disability groups. In relation to autism, it's usually best if you can get advice on autism, because the disability groups, they understand wheelchairs and how to make accessible buildings and stuff, but they're not necessarily very good at understanding autism. Autism not very long ago was a rare condition and people didn't understand it. And so the general disability groups aren't always supportive, and some local ones actually resent autism appearing on the scene. So you can actually not get some very helpful stuff. There are health and disability service providers. Be aware that there is this really arbitrary line between health and disability. So if you go looking for disability supports and somebody says, well, that's not really a disability issue, then it may be a health issue. The problem is that health may not be very good at helping you. So asking for help may not necessarily be successful. There's a formal scheme of disability advocates. There's a national disability advocacy program that funds disability advocates. They're funded independently of the NDIS, but they seem to be really, really overworked at the moment. But when you get into the tricky legal stuff, the NDIS is really not playing ball, then they're the people who really should be helping you. I should mention, of course, LACs and support coordinators. Mm-hmm. So they're part of the NDIS. They're the people you go to within the NDIS. There's a fair bit of peer support in different places around the country. Peer support can be quite good, but it can be a little bit misguided at times. Somebody mentioned before that when you go into meetings and things, it's really good to take somebody with you. So that's generally comes from personal friends and family. So you probably want to try and have some friends and family who are willing to go with you to meetings and just to be there to sort of say, hang on a minute, catch your breath, let's think about this rather than answering immediately, and just doing that kind of stuff, really. So
yeah, that's helpful.
That's probably the main list of people that I put down.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we covered most of the questions that we wanted to talk about tonight. We do have a couple of questions come through the Q&A. The first question is a good one. It's related to getting supports for private tuition for children who have learning disabilities like dyslexia and dyscalculia with ADHD or autism. So essentially, is it possible to get NDIS funding for supports that help with more academic skill development? The person asking the question didn't think it was possible, but it sounds like some people do. So how do they do this? Shannon, do you want to answer that? Because I know you've done some work in transitioning kids into schools.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about support that is in school, we need to be sure to talk about it as support that is above and beyond the reasonable adjustments that the school is required to make, and that it's specific to your child's disability. Because there's this tricky point where maybe school doesn't have enough funding to provide the support that you need, but if you go into the NDIS and say that, they're going to say, well, that's education's problem, that's not ours. Whereas we are arguing more from a perspective of the school are making the reasonable adjustments that they're required to make, but my child's disability requires them to have specific supports around the social and behavioural components of learning and school, not the academic part. That's how we divide it. I don't know if Bob and Vicky, if you have any other experience in that.
I have a lot of experience in this. I had a 10-year court case against the ACT Education Department. It is really tricky. I actually wrote an addendum in the Autism Handbook about how to deal with schools over some of this stuff. So people might want to look at that. The Autism Handbook has a thing. It basically says, when the school says, we can't help you, so if it's an education support issue, then theoretically education is supposed to help. Although it gets to a point where you're sort of comparing it with private tutoring and things, which is not necessarily the education department's role. Mm-hmm. So it does get a bit difficult to work out where the boundaries are of this.
Yeah.
There is a COAG document that defines what education should fund and what NDIS is responsible for. It's a table that talks about, talks about individual supports in certain circumstances. We can probably get that, Erin, and share that as well.
Yeah.
One thing I would say though about this is the strategy that I use is when a school says, oh, we don't have the resources to do that, I go into helpful mode, right? And I ring up the minister and say, oh, I'm just trying to get some help for the school here who can't get the resources that they need. So we're helping the school here. We're not having a fight with the school. So you don't ever fight with your school, right? You go into help the school get the resources that they want mode. Now, people start helping you because schools don't like to have it pointed out that they can't help children who need support, because it's their job to do that. So when you then go to the minister and say, the school says it doesn't have the resources, please can you organise the resources? It causes all sorts of rebounds inside their whole political and education system, and you're likely to get the resources and supports that you need.
Yeah. I would also think about how learning disabilities like dyslexia and dyscalculia affect the child's ability to be independent in the big wide world outside of the school context. Like how does that impact the child's ability to read signs, safety signs, or signs in the community, or be able to use money or tell time or follow, a schedule at home? Think about how those learning disabilities impact their non-academic life. And you may be able to build a compelling case to get funding that works on those life skills, but then those gains the child is making very well could generalize back into the school setting. So you might want to take that angle as well.
So the people I'd go to for help with that would be, again, the disability advocacy program. So you sort of put the hard word on them to help you get the supports that your child needs in those kind of settings.
Yeah.
it actually gets really complicated. So you need to think about this stuff a fair bit. It's
Yeah.
like we're having a whole bunch of stuff around at the moment where parents are saying, how do I get my child vaccinated? What's the process for having them tranquilized so that they can be vaccinated? And you're sort of going, what we did with our kids was in school, we actually had programs that had needles floating around so they would see them, and we'd have pretend needles being given until they were used to it, so that when a vaccination came up, it was far less threatening, but it was because it was done in an environment that was comfortable and familiar, and they were already familiar with it, rather than this is an unusual event. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you need to think about how this fits into both education and the rest of the community.
Right.
Tricky.
We have another question. This is a question related to a 14-year-old who has a diagnosis of autism level 2. He was assessed for eligibility 2 years ago, but didn't quite meet the criteria. And also diagnosed with ADHD and dysgraphia. They haven't been able to fund a lot of interventions, so the only reports they have are old. They don't really have current reports that kind of demonstrate the child's level of need or progress or lack of progress with specific programs. How do they navigate becoming a participant in the scheme with no real previous treatment reports? Can they just ask to be assessed again to get eligibility, go out and spend that funding and get some intervention and come back and say we need more funding because we didn't get enough the first time around? How do you think you should navigate that situation?
So basically you need to go to the AAT and have it reviewed, and the NDIS might turn around and say, well, we don't have enough information. You say, okay, where do we send the bills? First question, where do we send the bills, right? Because once you're in the AAT, if that issue arises, then the AAT will be pretty insistent that the NDIS pays for the assessments, okay? So you need to ask the AAT to review the eligibility decision. And then when the discussion comes up in the conciliation about there's not enough information, or we're disputing the amount of information, then you simply say, so where in the NDIS do we send the bills for the assessments that we need? And you can then go and have all the assessments paid for by the NDIS in that conciliation process.
So basically what it sounds like is that you had an access request that was denied a few years ago. Now you can is it possible a few years later, now that the child has an autism diagnosis, which they didn't have before, can they apply again with the new information to say, you denied us last time, we're applying again, hopefully we'll get accepted this time around? That's possible, right?
And level 2 is on list A, so
you should get accepted. Yeah,
there's an expectation that it's highly probable that you'll get in. And
yeah.
if you have autism level 2 with other things, gee, they'd be pushing their luck to deny you.
Yeah.
Actually.
So autism, ADHD, dysgraphia. So it sounds like what you should do is put in a new access request with the new information about the diagnosis. Then if you get denied, what you can do is request a review of that decision, and it will potentially go to what's called AAT, which is the Administrative Appeals Tribunal.
You actually have to take it there yourself.
Oh, okay. It's an independent, how would you describe AAT? It's like an independent court.
Yeah, well, it's
other decisions.
Yeah, it's just it's a legal process for reviewing government decisions.
Right.
And it's part of the Act. I mean, it basically says there are certain decisions. So part of and people can actually read the Act. The Act is not that hard to read.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But or sit down with some friends and say, what does this say? Which would be a great dinner party. Let's read the NDIS Act.
I'd do that.
The other thing sorry, Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, it says that basically you can appeal that. So there's a form on the AAT website, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal website, that you say, my access was denied. I want the decision reviewed.
Yeah.
And I think that the other part of the question maybe that you're asking too is that you don't have reports that make recommendations for services right now. So let's assume that they find you eligible for the scheme and you go to planning, but you don't have recommendation letters. I think that you can still get a plan without those, and you may,
ask for a 6-month plan that's going to get those reports.
Exactly.
As part of that funding.
Yep. Yep. Perfect. Well, thank you. I think we got through all the questions. We only had a few. It's 9 o'clock, so I think we'll wrap it up for tonight. But we wanted to just invite you to join us for our next webinar, which will be on Monday, the 21st of June. We'll be talking about what does the evidence say about early intervention. So we'll be looking more closely at what is sort of considered best practice in early intervention for children with autism. That might be interesting to you, or feel free to tell your friends. We also would really appreciate it if you could complete our short feedback poll, which is completely anonymous, and I will launch it right now. If you don't mind taking just a quick second to complete that, that quick poll. And looks like a few more questions just came in. Good, okay, just some comments, no questions. So yeah, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna stop sharing here, taking just a quick minute to complete that anonymous poll. We would really, really appreciate it. I'll give you a quick second to do that. But we do really, really appreciate all of you guys coming online with us tonight. And we hope you found this information useful. Again, we will be following this up with webinar number 3 on evidence for early intervention. I think webinar number 4 will be on selecting the right therapy provider. And then I think webinars number 5 and 6 will be all about what to do if you're not happy with your plan and you need to have a review of your plan because either your goals have changed or you didn't get the funding that you need to cover the intervention that you require. We'll talk all about the ins and outs of that. So hopefully everyone can come along to some of our future webinars. Once you've finished the poll, that's all we've got for you tonight. So you're welcome to log off. But thank you, everybody. It was really good to be able to host this tonight. Bye. See ya. Bye. Bye, everyone. And the poll is ended. And I need to just download the results. Stop recording.